Right now, someone is sitting in prison for a crime they committed 3 years ago. They've been there through lawyers, appeals, postponements, and delays. Their case moved through a system designed to be thorough, fair, and humane. And when they're finally released, there's a 44% chance they'll be back within a year. That's modern justice. Meanwhile, the victim who testified at trial can barely remember the details anymore. The neighborhood where it happened has moved on. The crime exists only as a file number in a database somewhere. Here's what's strange. For most of human history, societies had crime, laws, and punishment, but almost no long-term imprisonment. Yet crime didn't spiral out of control. Communities didn't collapse into chaos. In fact, crime resolved faster and repeated less often. Not because medieval people were more moral, not because punishment was harsher, but because the system was built on a principle we've completely abandoned: consequences that don't fade. So to understand why crime lingers in modern society, you first need to see why it couldn't linger in medieval ones. And it starts with something we take completely for granted. In 1790, the Walnut Street prison in Philadelphia introduced something radical: the idea that criminals should be isolated from society to think about what they'd done. This was revolutionary. Before this, prisons existed only as holding cells, temporary spaces where you waited for your actual punishment: a fine, public shaming, banishment, or execution. Nobody stayed for years. The building wasn't the punishment. Today, the building is the punishment, and that shift changed everything. Medieval communities couldn't afford long-term imprisonment. Not morally, economically. Every person locked away was someone no longer farming, building, defending, or producing. In tight, labor-dependent societies, that loss was felt immediately. But there's something deeper here. Imprisonment doesn't just remove people from society. It removes consequences from memory. When someone is sentenced to 5, 10, or 20 years, the crime disappears from public consciousness. People move on. Details blur. The connection between action and outcome dissolves across time. Medieval justice couldn't afford that dissolution. In small communities, unresolved wrongdoing didn't fade. It festered. People took sides. Trust eroded. Rumors replaced facts. So justice had to move fast enough to prevent that slow rot. This is why medieval punishment focused on speed over duration. Not because people were impatient, but because delayed consequences don't teach, they confuse. Which reveals the first principle medieval societies understood that we've forgotten. The gap between crime and consequence determines whether anyone learns anything at all. Here's a modern statistic that makes no sense at first. The certainty of being caught deters crime far more than the severity of punishment. Studies show that increasing prison sentences from 5 years to 10 barely changes behaviour. But increasing the likelihood of being caught from 30% to 50%, crime drops immediately. Medieval societies operated on this principle instinctively. When a crime occurred, it entered communal awareness within hours. Everyone knew, everyone talked, everyone expected resolution. And resolution came fast, not because the system was efficient, but because delay itself was dangerous. The longer the gap between crime and consequence, the weaker the connection becomes. A punishment that arrives years later doesn't feel tied to the crime. It feels arbitrary, random, unjust even. Medieval justice collapsed that gap. Punishment followed closely enough that cause and effect stayed intact. The offender couldn't rationalize. The community couldn't forget. The lesson imprinted immediately. But today we've stretched that gap into oblivion. Arrest happens months after the crime. Trial happens months after arrest. Sentencing happens months after trial. Appeals stretch it further. By the time someone enters prison, the crime feels like ancient history. And here's what that does psychologically. It breaks the connection between action and outcome. That's not deterrence. That's a gamble. Medieval justice didn't allow gambling. The odds were too clear, the timeline too short. Transgression felt heavier because the future wasn't negotiable. And when punishment arrived quickly, it didn't just teach the offender, It taught everyone watching, which is why punishment was never hidden. Public punishment makes us uncomfortable. We imagine it as spectacle, cruelty performed for entertainment, but medieval societies didn't make punishment public to be brutal. They made it public because invisible consequences don't change behavior. Here's the principle: punishment works only if it enters communal memory. In small communities, information traveled through conversation. Making punishment public ensured everyone learned the same lesson at the same time. No rumors, no speculation, just shared reality. But today, we've inverted this completely. Punishment happens behind walls, processed by institutions most people never see. Trials are public in theory, but practically invisible. Prison exists as an abstraction, a place we know exists but never witness. And research shows that when consequences are invisible, deterrence weakens across entire populations. Medieval punishment compressed instruction. One public event could teach hundreds without repetition. The message wasn't "this person is bad." It was "this action produces this outcome always." That predictability shaped behavior. But there's something even more important than visibility. What happened after the punishment ended? Because in modern society, punishment has an expiration date. You serve your time, you're released, and theoretically, you're done. But in medieval society, punishment never ended. Here's a jarring statistic: 68% of released prisoners are arrested again within 3 years. Why? Not because prison failed to punish them, but because prison doesn't change their social reality. Someone leaves prison with the same networks, same pressures, same lack of opportunity. Maybe worse, because now they have a record that closes doors. But day to day, the world looks familiar. The temptations haven't moved. But medieval society worked differently. Punishment didn't end when the event finished. It followed you. Communities were small. People depended on the same circle of faces for survival. Your reputation wasn't a social bonus. It was infrastructure. It determined who trusted you with tools, livestock, money, or safety. Therefore, once a crime became public, your reputation changed permanently. Even after formal punishment, the social sentence continued. People remembered. They adjusted. Distance replaced familiarity. That loss couldn't be appealed. There were no clean slates, no moving to a new city where nobody knew you. Leaving meant abandoning the networks that kept you alive. Staying meant living with a permanently altered identity. So a person marked by wrongdoing didn't need constant surveillance. The community enforced boundaries through hesitation, caution, exclusion. Trust, once broken, was expensive to rebuild. This made crime genuinely costly, not because punishment hurt, but because the aftermath was permanent. Today, we've tried to erase this mechanism, and it's backfired. We believe in second chances, rehabilitation, the idea that people can change, and they can. But we've removed the social reinforcement that makes change stick. Someone leaves prison, and unless they're a celebrity, most people don't know. They re-enter society without the community knowing what to expect. No adjusted trust, no visible boundaries. So often, they return to the exact social conditions that produced the crime in the first place. Medieval punishment worked because social reality changed immediately and permanently. Modern punishment works poorly because social reality often doesn't change at all. Here's the paradox at the heart of modern criminal justice. The longer we imprison someone, the more likely they are to commit another crime when released. Studies consistently show this. Sentences longer than 5 years correlate with higher recidivism, not lower, meaning people are more likely to commit another crime after release, not less. And it's not hard to see why. Prison removes someone from society without resolving anything socially. Their family loses income, their skills atrophy, their connections to legitimate work disappear. Meanwhile, their connections to criminal networks strengthen. By the time they're released, they're more desperate, more isolated, and more embedded in the world that led to crime in the first place. Medieval communities understood this instinctively. Long imprisonment didn't just punish the offender, it punished everyone. Labour dropped. Families struggled. Communities absorbed the cost month after month with no resolution. Incarceration delays consequences without restoring trust. The offender is gone, but not reconciled. The victim receives no closure. The community remains uncertain. Medieval justice avoided this by making outcomes immediate, visible, and final enough for society to move forward. Long imprisonment does the opposite. It isolates consequences from public memory. People forget. Stories blur. When someone returns, the connection between crime and punishment has faded, but the disruption remains. Medieval justice promised clarity through consequence. Modern justice promises transformation, and then wonders why it so rarely delivers. When medieval punishment worked, it wasn't because people were terrified. It was because uncertainty was eliminated. Crime occurred. Consequence followed immediately. Everyone witnessed it. Reputation changed permanently. Life adjusted around that change. Nothing lingered unresolved. This reduced repeat crime in a very specific way, not by reforming people internally, but by changing their external reality. Once someone's identity shifted, their options changed. Trust narrowed, access shrank, risk increased, future decisions were made under different constraints. Repeating an offence wasn't just risky, it was irrational, because the outcome was known. The community's response was predictable, the personal cost compounded. Compare that to today. Someone commits a crime, gets caught maybe, goes to trial eventually, gets sentenced months later, serves time isolated from consequences, gets released into the same environment. Where did social reality change? It didn't. This is what modern systems struggle to replicate. Direct alteration of social conditions. Medieval punishment didn't promise to change people. It imposed clarity that changed how people related to each other, and that relational change did the work. Here's what's fascinating. We have research proving this still works today. Communities with strong social cohesion and visible accountability have lower crime rates, even when formal punishment is less severe. Restorative justice programs that bring offenders face to face with victims and community members show significantly lower recidivism. Why? Because they recreate the social visibility and relational accountability medieval systems had by default. This isn't an argument for returning to public shaming. It's an observation that consequences disconnected from social reality don't change behavior reliably. We've built elaborate systems to process crime, but we've removed the mechanisms that actually prevented it from repeating. Medieval justice feels brutal because it refuses to hide what consequences cost. Modern justice feels humane because consequences happen elsewhere, carried out by professionals far from daily life. But here's the question we avoid. Which system actually reduces harm over time? Medieval punishment was immediate, visible, and socially integrated. It was harsh, yes, but crime resolved quickly, repeated less often, and communities moved forward. Modern punishment is drawn out, hidden, and socially disconnected. It's gentler in theory, but crime lingers for years, recidivism is epidemic, and communities never get resolution. We've traded visibility for comfort, and in doing so, we've made consequences so abstract they barely shape behavior at all. This isn't an argument for returning to medieval justice. It's an observation about what we've lost in abandoning its core principles: speed, consequences that arrive before memory fades, visibility, outcomes witnessed by the community that needs to learn from them, social integration, punishment that changes relationships, not just removes people, finality, resolution that allows everyone to move forward. We've built systems that promise transformation but deliver prolonged uncertainty instead. And as long as consequences remain distant, abstract, and socially invisible, crime will continue to linger. We think punishment exists to make people better. That assumption feels humane. But it's also why our system fails. For most of history, punishment existed to make outcomes unmistakable, not prolonged, Not hidden, not negotiable. The goal wasn't to change who someone might become years later, it was to make sure everyone knew immediately what crossing a line meant. Modern systems stretch consequences across time. Medieval systems compress them into memory. One dissolves responsibility into process, the other fixed it into identity. And once you see that difference, modern criminal justice stops looking like progress. It starts looking like a system that's forgotten why consequences exist in the first place. Not to disappear crime, but to resolve it, so it doesn't linger.